All right, buckle up, everybody, because today on the deep dive, we are headed straight into ancient Greece for a look at Euripides' Medea.
Oh, yeah. Get ready for some serious drama.
Definitely. And we're using good old Wikipedia as our roadmap for this one.
Sounds good.
So we're talking ancient Greek tragedy here, and this play, it's got it all. Betrayal, revenge. I mean, we're talking about a woman who uses her magic powers to orchestrate some truly, well, unforgettable events.
Unforgettable is putting it lightly.
Right. And, it's pretty amazing that this play, written thousands of years ago, still has so much power to shock and move audiences today.
It really speaks to how deeply these themes of betrayal, revenge, and the consequences of power resonate with us, even across such a huge span of time.
Absolutely. So to kind of set the scene for those who might not be familiar with the story, Medea takes place in Corinth, and our main character is no ordinary woman.
Oh, no, not at all.
I mean, she's a sorceress, a princess from Colchis, which was considered a barbarian land by the Greeks.
Right, and that barbarian label is actually super important, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, we'll definitely circle back to that.
For sure.
So some of you might remember Medea from the myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece, where Jason sets out to retrieve this magical golden fleece.
Yeah, and Medea, well, let's just say she plays a pretty crucial role in helping him snag that fleece.
Crucial is an understatement, right? I mean, she uses her magic, her cunning, and even betrays her own family to help him succeed.
Talk about going all in for love. But as we all know, happily ever afters are, well, not always a guarantee.
Sadly, no.
And this is where things get really, really interesting.
Oh yeah, here comes the drama.
So fast forward a bit, and Jason, he decides to dump Medea for, let's just say, a more politically advantageous match.
Right. Glossy, the daughter of the king, no less.
Cold move, Jason. Really cold.
Absolutely a cold move.
And this is where Euripides, the playwright, really throws a wrench into the typical tragic heroine narrative.
I'm already on the edge of my seat.
Oh, yeah. Medea, she doesn't just, weep and wail and accept her fate.
No way.
No, she becomes this force of nature, just absolutely fueled by rage and this burning desire for revenge.
So she's not going down without a fight.
Oh, not even close.
Okay.
And you have to remember, this is ancient Greece where the gods were, constantly meddling in human affairs.
They love to stir the pot.
Right. And Medea, with her lineage and her magical abilities, she could tap into that divine power in ways that were both fascinating and terrifying to the Greeks.
That's a potent combination. Magic, rage, and possibly the favor of the gods.
A recipe for some serious drama, for sure.
So how does she start to put her revenge plan into action?
Well, first, she tries to buy herself some time, pleading with King Creon to let her stay in Corinth just one more day before being exiled.
Clever.
Right. And she even manipulates Jason, playing on his guilt and any lingering feelings of obligation he might have towards her.
But behind that facade, I bet she's already scheming.
Oh, absolutely. Behind that mask of desperation, she's already weaving this intricate web of destruction that will ensnare everyone who has wronged her.
I love how Euripides sets this up. It's like watching a master chess player carefully planning every move.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is how he subverts our expectations right from the start.
How so?
Instead of passively accepting her fate, Medea takes control.
That's a key difference.
Right. She actually secures a promise of refuge from Aegeus, the king of Athens.
So she has an escape route.
Exactly. She's already thinking 10 steps ahead. This isn't just a woman scorned. This is a woman with a plan, a very detailed and, let me tell you, a very dark plan.
Okay, so she's got her escape route. She's bought herself some time. What's the next step in this plan of destruction?
Well, she sets her sights on her ultimate targets, Jason, Gloss, and King Creon.
There's no holding back now.
No holding back at all. Medea, she presents Glossin with these beautiful gifts, a robe and a coronet, but of course they're laced with deadly poison.
Classic Greek tragedy move.
Right. And of course Glosses, she can't resist such exquisite gifts. And the poison takes hold, killing her in a truly horrific and agonizing death.
Oh, that's brutal.
It is, but Medea, she's not done yet. When Creon tries to save his daughter, he too is poisoned by the garments.
Oh, wow. So it's a double tragedy.
Exactly. It's a scene designed to shock the audience, to make them really question the very nature of justice and revenge.
Where do we draw the line between, seeking retribution and just becoming, a monster?
It's a question that hangs over the entire play.
And then it takes an even darker turn.
Oh yeah, this is where things get really, really intense.
Medea, she decides to take her revenge to the most unthinkable level.
You're talking about the children, Right.
Yes, the children. She kills her own children.
This is where Euripides truly pushes the boundaries of Greek tragedy.
It's a moment that has haunted audiences for centuries.
It's just so shocking and so disturbing.
Definitely. And we'll dive into the many interpretations of this act after the break, but for now, let's talk about that dramatic ending.
Okay, yeah.
So having enacted her revenge, Medea, well, she makes her escape in a chariot sent by none other than Helios, the sun god himself.
Talk about a mic drop moment.
Right. It's not just an escape. It feels almost like a divine endorsement. You know, like the gods themselves are saying, okay, Medea, you've done enough. We're out of here.
It leaves the audience reeling, questioning everything they thought they knew about right and wrong, justice, and the power of the gods.
That ending with the chariot of Helios, it's almost like, you know, Euripides is saying, all right, audience, you deal with this now.
Yeah, it's a total mic drop moment.
Totally. And it leaves us wrestling with so many questions, especially about Medea herself.
Right. I mean, is she a monster? Or a victim?
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, maybe even both.
It's that ambiguity, that refusal to give us any easy answers. That's what makes this play so powerful.
Exactly. And a big part of that ambiguity, of course, comes from that act that still has scholars debating today the killing of her own children.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to just label it as pure revenge, but you know, there's got to be a deeper layer there, especially when we remember that Medea, she's a mother.
Exactly. And some scholars, they argue that, you know, she sees it as the ultimate way to wound Jason, to take away what he values most.
That makes sense, but it's still so hard to grapple with.
It is. And there's even another interpretation, a much more, chilling one.
Oh.
Yeah, some scholars, they suggest that Medea, she actually believes she's protecting her children.
Protecting them? How so?
By killing them, she's saving them from the shame and persecution they would inevitably face, you know, as the children of a woman who has defied societal norms so brutally.
That's a terrifying thought.
It is, but it adds another layer to the play's complexity.
Absolutely. Suddenly, we're not just dealing with a vengeful woman, but a mother grappling with these unimaginable choices, you know, in a society that has utterly failed her.
Right. And let's not forget, you know, another big piece of the puzzle here is Medea's barbarian identity.
You mentioned we'd come back to that.
Yeah, because it's crucial. Remember, to the ancient Greeks, anyone who wasn't Greek was considered, less civilized, more prone to these passionate outbursts, you know, even violence.
So are we seeing Medea's actions through a lens of prejudice?
That's the question, isn't it? Is her rage, her willingness to go to such extremes, is that a product of her nature? Or is it, you know, a consequence of how she's been treated by Jason, by a Corinthian society that has totally othered her?
It's a really important question to consider. Are we condemning Medea for basically acting out the very traits that her barbarian label has imposed on her?
Exactly. It's something Euripides really forces us to grapple with, you know, this uncomfortable reality of how prejudice can shape our perception of others.
And speaking of perception, let's talk about all the fascinating ways Medea has been reinterpreted over the centuries.
Oh yeah, the adaptations. There are so many.
It's incredible how this play, written thousands of years ago, can still resonate with audiences today.
It really speaks to the power of this story, to the universality of these themes.
Totally. And you know, what's really striking is how these adaptations, they often reflect the anxieties and the societal debates of their own time.
Oh, absolutely. Like, for example, you have Robinson Jeffers' adaptation, which was a huge hit on Broadway back in the 1940s.
Right. I've heard of that one.
Yeah. In that version, Medea is portrayed as this fiercely independent woman, you know, battling against a patriarchal system.
It makes sense that it would have resonated with audiences at the time, especially women.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It was a time when, you know, women were fighting for their rights, for recognition.
And Judith Anderson's performance as Medea in that production, I mean, it became legendary.
Oh, yeah, for good reason.
Yeah.
But then you have something like Lars von Trier's television adaptation, which came out in the late 80s.
Oh, yeah, much more recent.
Right. And his version, it's much darker, more unsettling. It really dives deep into the psychological turmoil of Medea's grief and rage.
So it reflects a different set of anxieties, a different way of looking at the human psyche.
Exactly. It's so fascinating how the same source material can be interpreted in so many different ways, each one reflecting the values and concerns of its time.
And that's what makes great art so great.
Right. It acts as this mirror to society, reflecting our own anxieties, our struggles, our aspirations.
So as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive, I keep coming back to that final image, you know, Medea escaping in the chariot of Helios.
Yeah.
It feels like a victory, but it's a victory steeped in blood and, unimaginable loss.
Yeah, and that's the brilliance of Euripides. He doesn't, let us off the hook with a neat and tidy ending.
He leaves us with this really powerful image, one that forces us to confront, the messy realities of human nature and those devastating consequences of, well, pushing someone to their absolute breaking point.
For sure. It makes you wonder, if Medea were on trial today, would we see her as a cold-blooded killer or a victim of circumstance or maybe something much more complex?
Yeah, it's a question that really gets you thinking, would a modern jury look at Medea and say, guilty? Or would they say she was a victim and driven to do what she did?
Right. And it's that question that kind of leads us to a thought that I find super intriguing. And actually, it's not something that's explicitly spelled out in the source material. But what if we shift our perspective a little bit and we view Medea not just as a woman scorned, but as a political figure?
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
Because think about it for a second. Medea is a powerful woman. She's incredibly intelligent. She's a master manipulator. She knows how to leverage her unique position, her barbarian identity, her magic, all of it, to achieve her goals.
So you're saying maybe her endgame wasn't just about getting back at Jason, it was about something bigger.
Exactly. What if it was about dismantling those power structures, the ones that had oppressed her?
So instead of just focusing on Jason's betrayal, we could see her actions as a calculated rebellion against the entire patriarchal system of ancient Greece.
Exactly. She's a woman who's been denied a voice, treated as an outsider. So what if her violence, as shocking as it is actually a way of reclaiming her power? A way of forcing the world to see her, to acknowledge her agency and her rage.
It makes me think of all the modern adaptations that place Medea in these contemporary settings.
Well, yeah, tons of those.
And in some of those versions, she becomes like a symbol of resistance against societal norms, right?
Yeah.
Challenging gender roles, fighting for equality.
And that's a testament to just how relevant this play still is. It can speak to these really contemporary issues.
Absolutely.
And by viewing Medea through this kind of political lens, I think we can get a much deeper understanding of, how power operates in society, how it's used to silence certain groups, and those extreme measures that people sometimes resort to fight back.
Wow, it really makes you wonder if Euripides were writing Medea today. I mean, how would he portray her? Would she be leading a social movement, taking on corrupt politicians, going viral on social media to expose injustice?
Right. I mean, it's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it?
It really is.
And it reminds us that these themes that Euripides was exploring all those years ago, power, betrayal, revenge, they're not just confined to ancient Greece.
No, they're alive and well, unfortunately.
Sadly, yes. They're very much alive in our world today.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. Medea is one of those works of art that just stays with you long after you've experienced it. It challenges you. It makes you confront these uncomfortable truths about yourself and the world. And it pushes you to ask those really big, really messy questions about, morality and justice, about what it means to be human.
I completely agree.
So as you go forth and maybe even check out some of those modern adaptations we mentioned, think about this. How do you see Medea? Is she a victim? Is she a villain? Or is she, as we've been discussing, something far more complex?
And what does your answer say about how you view the world?
That's a great question to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Medea. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing. Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into neural networks? I know, it can seem a bit intimidating, all that techie stuff, but trust me, by the end of this, you'll have a good grasp on these things, no problem.
Yeah, and you'll see why they're such a big deal these days.
Absolutely. We'll be using this excerpt from the Wikipedia article on neural networks, machine learning, kind of like our roadmap for this deep dive.
It's a great resource. Really comprehensive.
Totally. So first things first, what exactly are these neural networks anyway?
Well, think of it like this. Imagine like a network of tiny little units, all connected together, kind of like a digital brain.
Okay, a digital brain. So these units, are they like artificial brain cells or something?
Exactly. They're called artificial neurons, and they're inspired by the neurons in our own brains.
Cool. So they're like mini brains all working together.
Kind of, yeah. Each neuron, it receives signals, processes them, and then sends out its own signal to other neurons. And the connections between them, they have different strengths, what we call weights, which determine how much influence one neuron has on another.
So it's like a giant game of telephone, each neuron passing on a message.
You got it. And the weights are like deciding how loud or quiet those messages are.
Gotcha. So just like in a real brain, these neurons are organized, right?
Right, into layers. You have an input layer, that's where the data comes in, an output layer where the results come out, and then, get this, one or more hidden layers in between.
Hidden layers? Sounds mysterious. What goes on in there?
That's where the magic happens. That's where the network learns all the intricate patterns, the relationships in the data.
So the more hidden layers, the smarter the network.
You could say that. It's like adding more processing power.
Makes sense. So give me an example. Like, what kind of things can these networks do?
Well, you could train a network to tell the difference between a starfish and a sea urchin, for example.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I show it pictures and tell it which is which, right?
Right. That's the training part. You feed it labeled data, and it makes predictions based on what it sees.
And how does it learn from that?
Well, we compare its predictions to the right answers, and then adjust the weights of those connections between the neurons.
So like giving it feedback.
Exactly. And by doing that, we reduce the errors, make its predictions more accurate.
So the more data it gets, the better it becomes.
Precisely. It's all about minimizing those errors, making the network as accurate as possible.
But what if it, like, learns the wrong thing? Like, maybe it sees most starfish pictures have a blue background and thinks anything with a blue background is a starfish, even if it's a dolphin.
That's a great point. It can happen. That's why it's so important to choose the right data and make sure it's not biased.
So it's not just about feeding it any data, but the right data.
Exactly. Quality over quantity, you could say.
Makes sense. Now, this whole idea of neural networks, this didn't just pop up out of nowhere, did it?
You might be surprised to learn that some of these ideas go way back, centuries even. Like minimizing errors to find the best fit for data. That's been around since the 18th century. Least squares, they called it.
Wow, so the roots of AI go that far back.
They do. It's fascinating, really. And then, in the 1940s, you had McCulloch and Pitts. They came up with a model for how neurons could work together.
Okay, so they were like the pioneers of this field.
There were. And then you had Donald Hebb. He came up with a theory about how learning actually happens in the brain. He said connections between neurons get stronger when they fire together.
So every time you learn something, your brain is rewiring itself, basically.
It's idea. Pretty cool, right?
Definitely. So who took it to the next level?
Frank Rosenblatt. In the 1950s, he developed the perceptron.
The perceptron rings a bell.
It was one of the first artificial neural networks, could learn simple tasks. And get this, even the U.S. government was excited about it. They started funding research.
Wow, so AI was a big deal even back then.
It was. They saw the potential, even though it was still early days. Now, those early perceptrons, they were a bit limited. They didn't have hidden units. We know those are crucial now.
Hidden units, like we were talking about before.
The same ones. They add extra layers of processing, make the network much more powerful.
So who figured that part out?
Well, the idea of multi-layer perceptrons with those hidden units was already being discussed in the 1960s by a guy named R.D. Joseph.
Wow, so it's like all these pieces were coming together.
Exactly. It was a collaborative effort, all these researchers building on each other's work.
So things really took off in the 60s and 70s then.
Oh, yeah. Big time. In 1965, you had Ivaknenko and Lapa. They came up with the group method of data handling.
Catchy name.
Right. But what it was the first deep learning algorithm that could handle a network with any number of layers.
So they were the ones who figured out how to create those really deep networks.
They were. And what's even cooler, they were also the first to use something called multiplicative units. We call them gates now.
Gates.
Yeah, they control the flow of information through the network, like transistors in a computer chip.
So that idea goes all the way back to the 60s.
It does. And speaking of ideas that have stood the test of time, in 1967, Shunichi Amari, he published this groundbreaking paper on training multi-layer perceptrons.
And what was groundbreaking about it?
He used a method called stochastic gradient descent. You know what? We still use it today.
Wow, so it's like the foundation of how we train these networks.
Exactly. It's all about making small adjustments based on the data until the network gets it right.
So not one big leap, but lots of little steps.
Exactly. But even though the idea was there, it needed more powerful computers to really take off.
That makes sense. These things must need a lot of processing power, right?
They do. And another crucial development was the ReLU activation function, introduced in 1969 by Kunihiko Fukushima.
Re-LU, I've heard that term before.
It's pretty fundamental in deep learning. It's a type of mathematical function that determines how a neuron responds to its input.
So, like, the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And it turned out to be a very powerful tool. So yeah, the 60s and 70s, those were really important years for this field.
It's amazing to think about all these researchers all over the world contributing to this.
It really is. It's a testament to the collaborative nature of science.
Now, we talked about backpropagation before, that thing about adjusting the weights. Can we dig a bit deeper into that?
Sure. It's all about using calculus, basically.
Yeah.
It lets us see how changing one weight affects the whole network, and then we can use that to improve its performance.
So it's like tracing the errors back and figuring out what needs fixing.
Yeah, like a detective. And, fun fact, the term backpropagating errors, that was coined by Rosenblatt, the perceptron guy, back in 1962.
Wait, he had the name for it but couldn't make it work?
Not at the time. It wasn't until later, with guys like Linama, Werbos, and Rumelhart, that backpropagation really took off.
So sometimes an idea needs time to, like, mature.
It does. And speaking of breakthroughs, what about those convolutional and recurrent neural networks I keep hearing about?
Yeah, those sound pretty important.
They are. Convolutional neural networks, CNNs for short. Those have changed everything for computer vision.
Computer vision, you mean like teaching computers to see?
Exactly. CNNs are designed to take advantage of how images are structured. They use filters to scan the image, extract features like edges, corners, textures.
So it's like teaching them to see the way we do?
You could say that, and then those features are processed and the network learns more and more about the image.
Cool. So where did CNNs come from?
Kunihiko Fukushima's neocognitron in 1979 was one of the early pioneers. And then a bit later, Jan LeCun came up with LeNet, a CNN that could recognize handwritten ZIP codes.
Wow, from ZIP codes to, like, self-driving cars, it's come a long way.
It has. And then you have recurrent neural networks, or RNNs. They're great at processing things that unfold over time, like speech or text.
So, like, information that's not just a static image.
Right. Unlike those feed-forward networks, where information goes one way, RNNs have loops, so information can persist.
So it's like the network has a memory.
Exactly. That's what makes them good for language, music, things like that.
So they're like the artists of the AI world.
You could say that.
Okay.
And those early RNNs, they were actually inspired by research in psychology.
Wow, so we're learning from the brain to create artificial brains.
It's a pretty amazing loop, isn't it?
It is. Now, I know there are tons of different types of neural networks out there. Can we take a quick look at that landscape?
Absolutely. But they all rely on the same basic building block, the artificial neuron.
Those little processing units we were talking about.
The very same. Each one takes inputs, multiplies them by their weights, adds a bias, and then uses an activation function to produce an output.
So, like, each input gets a vote, and the weight is how much their vote counts.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Now, these neurons are organized into layers, and how they're connected determines the type of network.
So different wiring for different tasks.
Precisely. We already talked about feed-forward networks where information flows one way, but then you have recurrent networks. Those have loops, so information can flow back.
So the architecture determines how information moves through the network.
You got it. And then there are all these settings, what we call hyperparameters, that control the learning process.
So it's like fine-tuning the network.
Exactly. Things like the learning rate, the number of hidden layers, the batch size, all those need to be carefully chosen.
So it's like a recipe. You need the right ingredients and the right proportions.
Absolutely. It takes experimentation to get it right.
Okay, so we've talked about how these networks work, but how about their real-world applications? What are they actually good for?
Oh, so many things. Predictive modeling, data processing, system identification, pattern recognition, sequence recognition, sensor data analysis, robotics, data mining, finance, medical diagnosis, you name it.
Wow, that's a lot. So they're basically everywhere.
Pretty much. They're changing everything from how we shop to how we diagnose diseases.
It's mind-blowing.
It is. And we're only just getting started.
This has been a great overview. I feel like I'm starting to get a grip on these neural networks.
It's great to hear.
But there's got to be more to the story, right?
Oh, there's so much more.
Yeah.
We've only just scratched the surface.
Stay tuned, everyone, because in the next part of our deep dive, we're going even deeper. We'll explore the theory behind these networks, some of the challenges they face, and what the future might hold.
It's going to be fascinating.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing. Welcome back, everyone. Last time we explored what neural networks are and how they evolved from some pretty old school mathematical ideas. We even saw how they're already being used to do some pretty amazing things, like helping doctors diagnose diseases and picking out our next binge-worthy show.
It's pretty incredible stuff.
It is. But I'm curious, there's got to be more to it than just feeding these networks tons of data. Like, what's going on under the hood?
Well, one of the most fascinating things is their computational power. A classic type of network, the multi-layer perceptron, is actually what we call a universal function approximator.
Universal function approximator. Okay, now you're just using big words. What does that even mean?
Fair enough. It means that, in theory, a multi-layer perceptron can learn to represent any mathematical function, no matter how complex. It's like a Swiss Army knife for math problems.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. But if it can learn anything, why don't we just use neural networks for everything?
Well, there are a few catches. While we know they can theoretically do all these amazing things, we don't always know exactly how many neurons, layers, or connections are needed to achieve a specific goal. It's like having a recipe without knowing the exact measurements.
So it's like trying to bake a cake without knowing how much flour to use.
Exactly. Designing a neural network often involves a lot of trial and error, testing different architectures, and tweaking the settings, what we call hyperparameters, to find the best fit for the task at hand.
Speaking of fitting things, how much information can these networks actually hold? Do they have like a limit, like a hard drive?
That's a great question. There are a couple of ways to think about the capacity of a neural network. One is information capacity, which refers to how much information it can store based on the data it's given. But it's not as simple as measuring it in bytes. It's more about the complexity of the functions it can represent.
So it's not like a hard drive with a fixed size?
Not exactly. There's also something called the VC dimension, which is a bit more technical, but it basically measures the maximum theoretical capacity of a network under ideal conditions.
Ideal conditions, meaning perfect data and a flawless learning process.
Precisely. But of course, the real world is rarely ideal. And that brings us to the concept of convergence.
Convergence. Does that have something to do with the network making up its mind?
You could say that. When we train a neural network, we're guiding it towards a solution, a set of weights, that minimizes the error on the training data. Ideally, we want it to converge to a global minimum, meaning the absolute best solution possible.
So it's like finding the lowest point in a valley. You want the network to settle at the very bottom.
That's a great visualization. But unfortunately, things aren't always that simple. Neural networks can sometimes get trapped in local minima, which are like little dips in the valley.
So it's like thinking you've reached the bottom, only to realize there's an even deeper spot just around the corner.
Exactly. There are techniques to help overcome these challenges, but convergence is still an active area of research.
It sounds like training a neural network is a bit like taming a wild animal. So much potential, but also unpredictable.
I like that analogy. And then there's the question of generalization.
Generalization, is that about making sure the network doesn't just memorize the answers, but actually learn something useful?
Exactly. We want our networks to be able to perform well, not just on the data they were trained on, but also on new, unseen data. It's like studying for a test. You don't just want to memorize the answers, you want to understand the concepts.
Right, you want to be able to answer new questions that weren't on the practice test.
Exactly. One challenge is overfitting, where the network gets too focused on the specific details of the training data and doesn't generalize well to new examples. It's like becoming a world champion at recognizing dog breeds, but then not being able to tell a cat from a squirrel.
So how do we prevent that from happening?
One technique is called regularization. It basically encourages the network to be simpler and more general in its learning. It's like saying, hey, network, don't get too hung up on the tiny details, focus on the big picture.
So it's like adding some discipline to the learning process.
Precisely. We also use statistical analysis to assess the confidence of a trained network, meaning how much we can trust its predictions. This involves things like confidence intervals and estimating variance.
So it's like adding error bars to the network's predictions, giving us a sense of how reliable they are.
Exactly. These statistical tools help us understand the limitations of our models and make more informed decisions based on their predictions.
Wow, it sounds like there's a whole world of theory and statistics underpinning these neural networks.
There is. And while those aspects can get complex, they're crucial for understanding how these networks work, what their limitations are, and how we can make them more reliable and robust.
Okay, so we've talked about the power of neural networks and how they learn. But as with any powerful technology, there are bound to be some criticisms and concerns. What are some of the things people are worried about?
That's a great point. One common criticism, especially in fields like robotics, is the sheer amount of data required for neural networks to perform well. They can be real data hogs.
So you're saying they need a ton of information to learn effectively.
They do. Training a neural network to do something complex, like drive a car, requires a massive amount of data, which can be expensive and time-consuming to collect.
I can imagine. So how are researchers addressing this data-hungry problem?
One promising approach is transfer learning. The idea is to train a network on one task and then fine-tune it for a different but related task,
Yeah.
leveraging the knowledge it's already acquired. It's like taking a course in one subject and finding that it helps you understand another subject more easily.
Ah, so it's like giving the network a head start.
Exactly. Another area of concern is the lack of transparency in how some neural networks make decisions. They can seem like black boxes,
Yeah.
making it hard to understand why they make certain predictions.
So it's like they're saying, just trust me, I know what I'm doing, but we don't really know how they arrived at their conclusions.
It can feel that way, yes. That's why there's a growing emphasis on explainability in AI. Researchers are developing techniques to make these networks more transparent and understandable.
So we can actually see what's going on inside.
In a way, yes. What about the hardware requirements? I've heard that training these networks can take a lot of computing power.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too.
That's true. Traditionally, training deep neural networks has required powerful and expensive hardware, like specialized GPUs.
So you need a supercomputer just to train these things.
It can feel that way, but the good news is that researchers are working on making neural networks more efficient, requiring less power and specialized hardware.
So making them more accessible.
Exactly. Another criticism you might hear is that neural networks are just hype, that they don't always live up to the expectations.
So they're not a magic solution for everything.
Not quite. It's important to remember that neural networks are still a relatively young technology. There are going to be bumps in the road as the field matures.
So we need to be realistic about their capabilities.
Absolutely. And the field is constantly evolving. Researchers are addressing these criticisms, striving for more efficient, transparent, and accessible neural networks. We're also seeing growing interest in hybrid approaches that combine neural networks with other AI techniques.
So blending different approaches to get the best of both worlds.
Precisely. These hybrid approaches could lead to even more robust and adaptable AI systems.
It sounds like the future of AI is all about collaboration.
It is, bringing together the best of different approaches.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful journey into the world of neural networks. We've explored the good, the bad, and the complex.
It's been my pleasure.
But before we move on to what the future holds for this fascinating technology, I'm curious to hear your overall thoughts. What makes them so special? And what are some key things we should keep in mind as we continue to develop and use them?
Neural networks are a truly remarkable achievement in artificial intelligence. They've already transformed so many industries, so many aspects of our lives, and honestly, we're just scratching the surface.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, both exciting and, a little intimidating.
It is. But I really believe that with careful consideration and, responsible development, we can harness the power of these networks and create a better future for everyone.
Well said. Now let's look ahead a bit. What are some of the recent advancements that have you particularly excited?
Oh, there's so many. But if I had to pick a few areas, I'd say image processing, speech recognition, and natural language processing. Those are really pushing the boundaries right now.
Okay, let's start with image processing then. What specifically has got you fired up?
We talked about how CNN's revolutionized image recognition and, well, they're only getting better. The progress in object detection is remarkable. Neural networks can now not only identify what's in an image, but also pinpoint its location with incredible accuracy.
So it's not just saying, hey, there's a cat in this picture, but actually drawing a box around the cat saying, here's the cat right here.
Exactly. And this has huge implications for things like self-driving cars, where accurately detecting pedestrians, vehicles, obstacles, it's absolutely crucial.
Right. Makes sense. What about medical imaging? Are neural networks helping doctors see things they might have missed before?
Absolutely. They're being trained to detect subtle patterns in medical images, patterns that might be invisible to the human eye, leading to earlier, more accurate diagnoses of things like cancer.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like AI is giving doctors a superpower, helping them catch diseases early and potentially save lives.
It really is. And it's not just about detection. Neural networks can also enhance images, make them clearer, easier for doctors to interpret.
So it's like giving them superhuman vision. That's remarkable. Okay, what about speech recognition? How are neural networks changing the way we talk to machines?
Speech recognition has come a long way thanks to neural networks, especially those with architectures like LSTM. We're seeing speech-to-text systems that are amazingly accurate, making it much easier to control our devices with our voice.
So those voice assistants, the ones we sometimes love to hate, are actually getting smarter.
They are. And it's not just about understanding individual words anymore. They're getting better at understanding the context, the nuances of speech, making those interactions feel more natural.
So it's like teaching a machine to not just hear us, but actually listen and understand. Now, what about natural language processing? That always seemed like the holy grail of AI, teaching machines to understand human language.
It's definitely a huge challenge, but neural networks are making some serious progress. Look at machine translation, for example. Systems like Google Translate are becoming incredibly accurate and fluent.
It's pretty amazing how these systems can break down language barriers, help people connect.
It is. And beyond translation, they're being used to analyze text, understand sentiment, even generate human-like text.
Wait, generate text? You mean like writing poems or emails? That seems a bit, I don't know, unnerving.
Yeah, even that. There are AI systems that can write news articles, marketing copy, even compose music. It definitely raises questions about the future of creativity.
It does. If machines can create, what does that mean for human creativity?
It's a fascinating question. I think that even with all its capabilities, AI is ultimately a tool. It can help us enhance our creativity, not replace it.
Like those AI-powered art tools, they're not replacing artists, they're helping them explore new things.
Exactly. And remember, those advancements we talked about in control systems, finance, medicine, those are still going strong.
Right, like robots, stock predictions, disease diagnosis, what's next for those?
In control systems, we're seeing neural networks become more adaptable, more robust. They can handle more complex, dynamic environments. This is leading to better robots, drones,
Yeah.
autonomous vehicles.
So robots that can learn from their mistakes, adapt to new situations, maybe even make us a cup of coffee in the morning.
Uh-huh. Who knows?
Mm.
And in finance, neural networks are being used to detect fraud, manage risk, and even offer personalized financial advice.
So it's like having a financial advisor who really understands you, your goals, your risk tolerance.
Precisely. And in medicine, well, we're seeing neural networks being used to personalize treatments, predict patient outcomes, even speed up drug discovery.
It's amazing to think about the potential of AI to improve human health and well-being in such impactful ways. It's like something out of science fiction.
It really is. And as these technologies keep evolving, we're bound to see even more amazing applications emerge.
Well, this has been an incredible journey exploring the world of neural networks. I feel like I've learned so much.
It's been a pleasure sharing this with you and your listeners.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about neural networks. It's a complex field, constantly evolving, but even a basic understanding can be incredibly valuable. As we keep exploring this frontier of AI, let's remember to do it with a sense of wonder, responsibility, and a commitment to using these powerful tools for the greater good. Until next time, keep those synapses firing and stay curious.
Welcome to our deep dive into one of the darkest chapters, I guess you could say, in American history.
Yeah.
Salem witch trial.
The Salem witch trials.
You've sent us some excerpts from the Wikipedia entry, so let's uncover the truth behind this infamous event. It all went down in 1692. But imagine a world where your neighbor's dream could land you in court, accused of witchcraft.
Yeah, it's almost unthinkable today, but back then the belief in witchcraft was deeply rooted in both European and colonial American society. What makes Salem so compelling is that it took place during a period when witch trials were waning in Europe, making it feel like a chilling echo of a fading era.
Right. Yeah, it seems like a recipe for disaster. A community gripped by superstition facing unknown threats. What was life actually like in Salem Village back then? Was it as idyllic as we sometimes picture colonial life?
Not quite. Imagine a small village simmering with tension. Forget picturesque farmland, pictureland disputes, arguments about grazing rights and church politics dividing the residents.
Oh, wow.
Their relationship with nearby Salem town was also strained, adding another layer of conflict.
So maybe not the quaint, peaceful village we often imagine. It sounds like a community already on edge. And then 1692 arrives, a year of immense political upheaval for the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony. We're talking about a transition from a royal charter to a new province charter, right?
Exactly. It was a time of immense uncertainty. Add to that the ongoing wars with Native American tribes, anxieties about new leadership, and a flood of refugees seeking safety. And you have a society under immense pressure, ripe for unrest and fear.
So we've got a community primed for conflict, facing a ton of external pressures. And on top of all that, they were trying to build a strict Bible-based society.
Right.
These were the Puritans, known for their unwavering religious devotion and strict moral code.
Precisely, deviation from the norm was met with suspicion, and in this context, accusations of witchcraft were a potent weapon. What's particularly disturbing is how often these accusations targeted those already marginalized, the poor, the outspoken women who challenged societal expectations.
Right. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly fear and suspicion can morph into dangerous accusations, especially when fueled by religious extremism. So where do the actual witch accusations begin? How does this powder keg finally ignite?
It starts in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, a prominent figure in Salem village. His daughter Betty and niece Abigail begin exhibiting strange and unsettling behaviors.
Yeah?
We're talking screaming fits, contortions, and claims of being pricked with pins. Imagine witnessing that as a villager already primed to see the devil's work at play.
It sounds terrifying. And I bet the doctors of the day, with their limited medical knowledge, only added to the confusion. There was no rational explanation for these girls' afflictions, making witchcraft seem like the only answer.
It's a classic example of how a lack of understanding can lead to the most dangerous conclusions. And tragically in Salem, that lack of understanding quickly turned into finger-pointing. The first three accused were Sarah Good, a destitute woman known for begging and muttering under her breath; Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church and was embroiled in a land dispute; and Tituba, an enslaved South American woman.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Tituba's story is especially tragic. She was already vulnerable as an enslaved woman, but her background also made her an outsider in this strict Puritan society. She practiced a blend of Christianity and traditional Thork beliefs, which probably seemed like witchcraft to the terrified villagers.
Exactly. She represents the intersection of multiple prejudices at play in Salem: fear of the outsider, fear of women who didn't conform, and a racial prejudice. This confluence of factors makes Tituba's accusation and the way it was received all the more chilling.
So with those initial accusations, the fear seems to become contagious. It wasn't long before more prominent members of the community were being targeted, right? It wasn't just the outcasts anymore.
That's right. The accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by the girls' increasingly dramatic performances and the growing sense of paranoia in the village. Soon, even respected figures like Rebecca Nurse, a devout church member known for her piety, and Martha Corey, a woman of impeccable reputation, found themselves caught in the crosshairs.
Wow, that's incredible. If even your standing in the church couldn't protect you from accusations, it really shows how far the hysteria had spread. It seems like any sense of reason was completely gone at this point. And I remember reading that one of the most disturbing aspects of these trials was the use of spectral evidence, right? Can you explain what that is?
Imagine a legal system where your dreams could be used to condemn you. That's essentially what spectral evidence was. The afflicted girls, led by Abigail Williams, would claim they saw the spirits or specters of the accused tormenting them, even though the accused was nowhere near them physically.
It's hard to believe that such a thing would be admissible in court. But in the climate of fear that gripped Salem, these spectral visions were enough to seal the fate of many innocent people. It seems almost medieval in its absurdity.
It was a dangerous departure from any sense of due process. The court, instead of demanding tangible evidence, was swayed by these theatrical displays and claims of supernatural visions, and once the girls realized the power they held, the accusations escalated.
It's chilling to think about, but wasn't there another bizarre method they used called the touch test? That sounds even more ridiculous than spectral evidence.
The touch test was truly something. Imagine a scene straight out of a nightmare, a convulsing accuser and accused witch standing before them. If the accused touched the accuser and the fit subsided, they were deemed guilty.
It sounds more like a superstitious ritual than a legitimate legal procedure. It's almost as if logic and reason had completely evaporated in the face of fear.
That's precisely what happened. The touch test exemplifies the irrationality that permeated the Salem trials. It was driven by fear, fueled by superstition, and lacked any scientific basis.
And to make matters worse, even influential figures like Reverend Cotton Mather were adding fuel to the fire with their writings, aren't they? Mather was a prominent theologian and writer in the colony, and his early works on witchcraft certainly didn't help calm the situation.
Mather's role in the trials is complex. While he would later urge caution about spectral evidence, his early work undoubtedly contributed to the climate of fear and acceptance surrounding the trials. It's a reminder that even those in positions of authority can be swept up in mass hysteria, and their words can have unforeseen and tragic consequences.
It's almost like the entire community was caught in a web of delusion. It makes you wonder, how did it all end? Did the madness just burn itself out, or were there voices of reason that finally prevailed?
Thankfully, amidst the chaos and fear, there were individuals who began to question the validity of the trials and the evidence being presented. Nathaniel Saltonstall, a respected judge, resigned from the court, deeply troubled by the proceedings. And Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's father, and a leading figure in the Puritan community, began to urge caution, particularly regarding the reliance on spectral evidence.
So the cracks were starting to show in this wall of fear and accusation. Even those who had initially supported the trials were having second thoughts. That must have been a turning point.
It was. These voices of dissent coming from within the Puritan establishment were crucial in shifting public opinion. Eventually, Governor Phips, responding to growing concerns and perhaps realizing the absurdity of the situation, halted the trials altogether. He appointed a new court which specifically barred spectral evidence from being used in legal proceedings.
It's a relief to know that the madness finally ended, but the damage was already done. 19 people had been executed and countless others imprisoned, their lives shattered by the accusations and trials. The scars of the Salem witch trials must have run deep.
Absolutely. And while the execution stopped, the quest for justice was far from over. Decades later, survivors and families of those wrongly convicted began to fight for exoneration and compensation. They filed petitions demanding apologies and recognition of the injustices they had suffered.
That's incredibly powerful. Even after all that time, they refused to let the truth be buried. Their persistence speaks volumes about the enduring human need for justice and accountability.
Their efforts were ultimately successful. In the early 1700s, the Massachusetts legislature formally apologized for the trials and offered financial compensation to the victims and their families. It was a long overdue act of recognition, acknowledging the profound wrongs that had been committed.
That's incredible. So even though justice was delayed, it was eventually served. But it's hard to imagine Salem ever fully escaping the shadow of these events. How did the trials impact Salem's identity in the long run?
The Salem witch trials have become inextricably woven into the town's history and identity. While for many years there was a reluctance to acknowledge this dark chapter, over time it's become a source of both reflection and tourism.
It's fascinating how a historical event can shape a place's identity even centuries later. It seems like the trials have become a kind of cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria and unchecked power.
Exactly. The trials serve as a stark reminder of what can happen when fear, superstition, and a lack of critical thinking take hold. And they've had a lasting impact on American culture, inspiring countless works of art, literature, and film. Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, for example, used the trials as an allegory for the McCarthyist witch hunts of the 1950s, highlighting the parallels between these historical events and the dangers of political persecution.
It's remarkable how an event from 1692 can still resonate so powerfully today. It speaks to the universality of these themes, fear scapegoating the abuse of power. Speaking of which, one aspect that continues to fascinate me is the role of spectral evidence. It's almost inconceivable that dreams and visions could be used to condemn someone in a court of law.
It highlights how drastically our understanding of evidence and legal process has evolved. In 1692, Salem, the belief in the supernatural was so ingrained that spectral evidence was seen as legitimate. Today, we demand tangible proof scientific evidence, a clear chain of custody. The Salem trials underscore how important those safeguards are.
It makes you wonder if something like the Salem witch trials could happen again. Could we see a similar pattern of fear, scapegoating, and disregard for due process emerge in modern society, even with our advancements in science and law?
That's a question we should always be asking ourselves. While we might not see spectral evidence in a courtroom today, the underlying conditions that fueled the Salem trials, fear, social anxieties, and the desire to find scapegoats still exist.
So you're saying that even in our modern, technologically advanced world, we're not immune to the dangers of mass hysteria and persecution. Are there any modern-day witch hunts that we should be wary of?
We need to be vigilant about how certain groups are demonized and scapegoated, whether based on religion, ethnicity, political beliefs, or simply being different. The Salem witch trials remind us that this type of persecution can happen anywhere, anytime, if we allow fear and prejudice to override reason and compassion.
It's a chilling thought, but it's also a call to action. We can't be complacent. We have a responsibility to learn from history and to stand against injustice wherever we see it. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, there's one aspect of the trials we haven't explored yet: the medical theories surrounding the afflicted girl's behavior. Have researchers come up with any possible explanations for their strange symptoms beyond simply attributing it to witchcraft?
There have been a number of theories put forward over the years attempting to explain the girl's fits, contortions, and hallucinations from a medical or psychological perspective. One of the most prominent theories is convulsive ergotism, a condition caused by eating rye bread contaminated with a particular type of fungus.
That's interesting. So it's possible their bizarre behavior wasn't supernatural at all, but rather a physical reaction to something they ingested.
It's certainly a possibility. The symptoms of convulsive ergotism, including seizures, hallucinations, and muscle spasms, align with some of the behaviors described in the trial records. Other theories propose psychological explanations, suggesting the girls might have been experiencing a form of mass hysteria brought on by the stress and anxiety of living in a community under constant threat from Native American attacks and the rigid social constraints of Puritan life.
That makes sense. Imagine the pressure those girls were under, the fear they must have felt on a daily basis.
Yeah,
It's not surprising that their anxiety might manifest in such unusual and dramatic ways.
exactly. And in a society already primed to see the devil's work everywhere, those anxieties could easily be misinterpreted as something far more sinister. But regardless of the underlying cause of the girl's behavior, the Salem witch trials stand as a stark warning against the perils of jumping to conclusions, especially when fear and superstition are involved.
It's a tragic reminder that sometimes the simplest explanation isn't always the one that people are willing to see, especially in times of uncertainty and fear. But even without a definitive answer about the girl's behavior, the trials themselves offer a profound lesson about the dangers of mass hysteria, unfounded accusations, and the fragility of justice. It's a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is an ongoing process, and sometimes it takes generations to right the wrongs of the past. And it makes me think, are there any modern-day parallels to the Salem witch trials? I know you mentioned the McCarthy era, but are there other instances where we've seen similar patterns of fear, scapegoating, and the erosion of due process?
It's important to remember that the Salem witch trials, while horrific, weren't unique. They were part of a broader phenomenon of witch hunts that swept through Europe and colonial America, often fueled by social anxieties, religious extremism, and the desire to consolidate power. And those same underlying dynamics can still manifest today, even if they take on different forms.
So even though we might not be burning people at the stake anymore, we still need to be wary of these patterns of persecution and the ways they can creep into our society. It's like you said earlier, the conditions that fuel the Salem trials, fear, uncertainty, the search for scapegoats, those things haven't disappeared.
Exactly. We see it in the rise of conspiracy theories, the spread of misinformation, and the tendency to demonize those who hold different beliefs or come from different backgrounds. Think about the ways social media can amplify those fears and create echo chambers where extreme views can flourish. It's a breeding ground for the kind of mob mentality that led to the Salem trials.
It's a sobering thought, but also a call to action. What can we do as individuals to prevent these patterns from repeating themselves? How can we safeguard against these dangers in our own time?
It starts with education. Understanding the historical context of events like the Salem witch trials can help us recognize the warning signs and challenge harmful narratives. We need to be aware of the ways history can repeat itself, even if it doesn't wear the same clothes.
So knowledge is power. But it's not just about knowing the facts, right? It's about being able to think critically, to question what we hear and see, and to challenge those who seek to divide and exploit us.
Precisely. We're bombarded with information from all sides these days, so it's crucial to develop those critical thinking skills. Be skeptical. Check your sources, consider multiple perspectives. Don't get caught in echo chambers where your own beliefs are constantly reinforced.
It's about being an active participant in the search for truth, rather than passively accepting what we're told. And I think that ties into another point you made earlier, the importance of speaking out against injustice.
Absolutely. Silence in the face of wrongdoing is complicity. We need to be willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. Challenge prejudice, call out discrimination, advocate for the rights of all people.
It's about remembering that our individual actions can have a collective impact. And I think the legacy of the Salem witch trials, the resilience of the survivors and their families who fought for recognition and exoneration, is a testament to that.
Their persistence reminds us that the fight for justice is never truly over. It's a continuous process that requires vigilance, courage, and a commitment to truth. And while the Salem witch trials represent a dark chapter in human history, they also offer a powerful lesson about the importance of learning from the past, safeguarding our freedoms, and striving to create a more just and equitable world.
Well, this deep dive has been a journey into the dark side of human nature, but it's also been a reminder of our capacity for resilience, compassion, and the pursuit of justice. It's a story that continues to resonate centuries later, urging us to be vigilant, to challenge injustice, and to never forget the lessons of the past. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Salem witch trials. We encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating and complex period in history and to reflect on its relevance to our world today.